Carlos pushed the door of the house with immense force, exhausted after a long day of work, but his irritation seemed even more intense than his accumulated fatigue. He quickly said goodbye to his colleagues in the office, but now, upon stepping into the home he shared with Livia, the frustrations of the day turned into a storm of criticism. The smell of dinner that hung in the air didn't please him, and the first thing he did was head to the kitchen, where Livia was finishing setting the table. "That's great. Once again you did the same thing. Rice and beans, as always. Can't you change it up a little? Is that all you know how to do?" Carlos snapped, with a tone of disdain that made Livia's heart sink. He looked at the pan as if observing a miscalculation in a complex equation. "Is this what you call dinner? A food for elephants?" Livia stopped for a moment, her gaze fixed on the table she had carefully prepared. The tears threatened to escape, but she fought them. "Carlos, I just wanted to do something simple. You know I'm not feeling well and—" He began to justify, his voice trembling, but was interrupted. "Yes, I know you're not feeling well. And that's your fault. If you cared a little more about your health, maybe you wouldn't be so fat and lazy." Carlos laughed, a cruel laugh that echoed through the kitchen. "Look at you. Sometimes I wonder how you manage to trap me here. It's almost torture." Those words cut like a knife. Livia felt that the small flame of hope that she kept burning was quickly extinguished. She had tried so hard to prepare that dinner, to create a welcoming environment, but it all seemed in vain. "Carlos, please. I just wanted you to know that I care about you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but the insecurity showed through. "Care? Do you mind eating? Look at you." He paused, looking directly into her eyes, as if trying to penetrate her soul. "You do not care about me. I deserve more than that. I deserve someone who takes care of themselves, who values themselves. You're not that, Livia." Livia shrank, feeling the weight of his gaze, and turned to the sink, trying to hide the tears that were now flowing freely down her face. I will try to improve. I promise I will try harder," he said, his voice breaking. "Promises don't change reality. The only thing you do is embarrass me. You know I could be with someone who's really worth it, but I'm stuck with you." Carlos snapped, anger growing in his tone. He walked away from the kitchen, as if he were moving away from something disgusting, and threw himself onto the living room sofa. The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. Livia felt her heart shatter, but she also felt a small spark of revolt beginning to awaken within her. What had happened to the once confident woman? The one who dreamed of a bright future? Carlos had reduced her to a shadow of herself, and she was tired of it. At that moment, she decided that she would no longer allow him to hurt her. The anger was a new but welcome feeling. The desire to free myself from the pain began to take shape. After a few more minutes of tension, she decided she needed some time alone. With hesitant steps, he headed to the bathroom, closing the door behind him with a soft but decisive click. Inside the bathroom, she looked at her reflection in the mirror. The image that returned his gaze was that of a haggard woman, with deep circles under her eyes and a sad expression. "You are more than that," she murmured to herself, trying to remember who she was before Carlos. "You are strong. You deserve to be happy." The words seemed to echo, but still, they weren't enough to erase the pain he felt. Hands shaking, she turned away from the mirror and sat on the cold bathroom floor, her back against the door. The tears continued to roll down his face, but now they were accompanied by a new feeling: determination. "Enough," he whispered. "Enough of submitting to this. You are not an elephant, you are a woman." That night, marked by insults and humiliation, would become a turning point in Livia's life. She was tired of being the joke, of being belittled by a man who didn't value her. With a new purpose welling up within her, she promised that she would no longer submit to this pain. Slowly, words began to form in his mind. A plan began to emerge, a path that would take her away from suffering and towards a new destiny. The light from the bathroom illuminated her face as she stood up, wiping away her tears and taking a deep breath, feeling the change beginning to occur. "Carlos will no longer have power over you," she said to herself, with new determination. "You will show him and yourself that you are stronger than he ever believed you could be." And so, while the echo of Carlos' cruel laughs still sounded in her ears, Livia began to dream of the woman she wanted to become. The bathroom door closed, but a new window of opportunities opened, and she was ready to explore them, no matter how difficult the journey. Carlos was in a bar in the city, a place frequented by friends and acquaintances, where he was known for his self-confidence and his bad jokes. That night he was especially excited. His new lover, Fernanda, a young woman of stunning beauty, was at his side, laughing at his stories. Carlos never tired of showing off his new achievement, and with each sip of beer, his excitement increased. "Look at this beauty, boys," Carlos said, with a smug smile, as he ran his fingers through Fernanda's hair. "Not just anyone can replace me, right, Livia?" "Well, Livia doesn't even come close to her," he added, with a tone of contempt in his voice that made his friends laugh. One of the friends, Rafael, smiled and raised his glass. "Hail to Carlos, the man who finally got rid of a lazy fat lady." The collective laughter echoed around the table, and Carlos felt at the height of his happiness, as if he were on top of the world. Meanwhile, Fernanda just smiled, not caring about the nasty comments about Livia. For her, what mattered was that Carlos had chosen her. "You don't know what it's like to live next to a woman who only eats and sleeps, man," Carlos continued, exaggerating his words. "Livia only knows how to make food, and she doesn't even do that right. I don't know how I managed to stay with her for so long." The friends laughed again, while Carlos let himself be carried away by his own lies. In his mind, he was convinced he had made the right choice. His new life with Fernanda seemed perfect, and he was determined to make it even more glorious, at Livia's expense. Meanwhile, at home, Livia was far from aware of the contempt Carlos felt for her. That night, she was sitting on her bed, wearing loose, comfortable pajamas. Silence enveloped her, and the only light that entered the room was from a soft lamp next to her bed. She looked up at the ceiling, remembering the cruel words Carlos had said to her earlier. The offenses still echoed in his mind, like a distant and painful echo. "He will never change," he thought, as tears ran down his face. "Why did I let myself get to this point?" Livia felt a mix of sadness and anger, an anger that was beginning to boil inside her. It was anger against Carlos, but also anger against herself for having allowed him to treat her that way. That same night, while Carlos was having fun, Livia decided she needed help. She remembered a support group a friend had mentioned, a place where people with self-esteem issues came together to share experiences and gain strength. With a boost of courage, he decided that he would look for this group the next morning. After a night of insomnia, with confused thoughts and a heavy heart, Livia woke up determined. She put on a simple outfit, but one that made her feel a little better, and walked to the city center, where the group was meeting. The place was welcoming and, upon entering, she was greeted by smiles and understanding looks. The people there knew what it was like to struggle, and there was a genuinely supportive environment. "Hi, my name is Livia," she introduced herself, with a slight tremor in her voice. I'm here because I need help." The words left his lips like a breath, and as he said it, a huge weight seemed to have been lifted from his shoulders. The group's mentor, a middle-aged woman named Anna, walked over and smiled warmly. "Welcome, Livia. Here, you will find a safe space to talk about your experiences. You don't need to feel alone." The meetings became a healing space for Livia. She began sharing her stories and listening to other people's stories, all united by a common goal: to regain her self-esteem and learn to value herself. As the days passed, she realized that she was not alone. There were other people who had also been in abusive relationships and were struggling to get back on their feet. One night, upon returning home after a meeting, Livia sat at her kitchen table, the soft light from the lamp illuminating the room. He looked at a notebook he had found in one of the drawers. On impulse, he picked up a pen and started writing. The words flowed like an outburst, a silent cry for freedom. She described her experiences, her pain, but also her hopes and dreams. "Today I decided that I will no longer let myself be underestimated," she wrote. "Carlos may have made me believe that I am less, but I know that I am more than that." Every word seemed to strengthen his resolve. She was determined to take control of her life and free herself from the ties that tied her to the past. The diary became a refuge, a space where she could express everything she felt without fear of being judged. With each page filled, Livia felt that she was reconnecting with her essence, with the strong woman who had remained dormant for a long time. Over time, she began to look at herself in the mirror differently. The tears and sadness gave way to a firmer look, to a face that began to reflect the woman she wanted to be. Although there was still a long way to go, Livia felt that each day was a new opportunity to rediscover herself. Carlos, in turn, continued his life carefree, oblivious to the changes occurring in his wife. He was so involved in his new relationship that he didn't realize how much Livia was getting stronger. With each laugh he shared with Fernanda, with each day that passed, he moved further away from the woman who was once his partner. That night, as she was getting ready for bed, Livia made a promise to herself. "I will no longer allow anyone to make me feel less than. From today onwards, I am the owner of my life." With that determination, she closed her notebook, feeling lighter and more hopeful than she had in many years. The path was just beginning, but now she had the strength to move forward. Carlos was decided. He had spent weeks planning his new life with Fernanda, as if Livia were just a shadow of the past, a memory that could be erased as easily as a draft on a sheet of paper. He thought about what his new routine would be like, full of fun, carefree, and, above all, beauty. In the back of his mind, the image of Livia, with her body that he despised so much, was a weight that he was determined to leave behind. On a sunny Saturday, Carlos decided it was time to face Livia. He imagined her sitting on the sofa in the living room, with the same dejected expression he already knew so well. The idea of seeing her writhing in pain upon hearing the news of their separation was something that amused him. He was ready for this moment, without any compassion. Upon opening the door to the house, a smell of food filled the room. Livia was in the kitchen, preparing something that he would definitely criticize. "Look, what are you doing?" Carlos said, with a sarcastic tone. "Do you expect me to be impressed by this food?" Livia turned around, surprised and a little scared by her husband's sudden entrance. Her eyes were tired, but there was a new determination in her gaze. She had spent months rebuilding herself, and Carlos' words no longer had the same weight. "I'm just preparing lunch, Carlos," she replied, trying to remain calm. "You always get home so late, I thought a hot dish might be nice." "Good." Carlos laughed, a cynical laugh that echoed through the kitchen. "You know I don't eat that anymore. Don't forget that I now have a health-conscious girlfriend." Livia's heart sank at his words. The mention of Fernanda was like a sharp knife, but she refused to let it affect her. "I just want you to be happy, Carlos," she said, in a calm voice, although her heart was conflicted. "If that's what you want, I can't stop it." Carlos raised an eyebrow, surprised by her response. He expected tears, screams, a dramatic scene, not this contained apathy he was seeing. It bothered him, but he tried to ignore it. "You have no idea what happiness is, Livia," he stated with disdain. "You only know how to hide behind your fatness and your weakness." Livia took a deep breath, feeling the anger begin to boil inside her. It wasn't just the criticism of her body that bothered her, but the disregard for her fight. With the new strength she had cultivated, she decided that she would no longer allow him to diminish her. "You may think you know me, Carlos, but you are wrong," she said, looking into his eyes firmly. I'm discovering myself, and that's much more than you can understand." Carlos seemed intrigued, but also irritated. He wasn't used to seeing Livia take a stand. Her new attitude made him feel uncomfortable, almost threatened. "What do you intend to do? Dancing while I'm with Fernanda?" He tried to laugh, but it sounded nervous, like he was trying to avoid the truth. "Actually, I signed up for dance classes," Livia said, with a smile that she couldn't hide. "I want to learn to love myself." Carlos was silent for a moment, his eyes wide. He didn't know whether to laugh or get angry. The idea of Livia dancing, moving with grace, was something he couldn't process. "You? Dancing?" he repeated, almost as if he was testing the durability of reality. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "You may think it's ridiculous, but that's what I'm doing," Livia replied, confidence growing. "I won't be your joke anymore." Carlos laughed, but there was a hint of nervousness in that laugh. He started pacing back and forth, not knowing how to react. "And do you think this will change anything between us?" he questioned, his voice rising a little. "I've already made my decision, Livia. I'm leaving." She looked at him, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. The relief was from the certainty that finally he was moving away, but the sadness came from the loss of a relationship that, despite everything, had been part of his life for so long. "I understand, Carlos," she said, with a serenity that surprised her. "But I won't be your victim anymore." Carlos stopped and looked at Livia, not knowing whether he should feel threatened or amused. He no longer recognized her, and that bothered him deeply. "You can't just leave me like this, Livia," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "You have nowhere to go, you have no friends." "I have friends, yes," she replied, her voice firmer. "And I'm surrounding myself with people who support me. And you can go, Carlos. I won't beg for you." There was a heavy silence in the room, and Carlos, in his arrogance, could not understand that Livia had begun to free herself. With one last look of contempt, he turned and left, leaving Livia alone, but not helpless. As soon as the door closed, she felt a wave of relief. An involuntary smile appeared on her lips as she allowed herself a moment of silent celebration. On this day, she no longer felt invisible. Instead, there was a new horizon in front of him. In the following days, Livia dedicated herself completely to dance classes. She discovered that by moving to the beat of the music, she was not only losing weight, but also gaining something much deeper: confidence in herself. The mirror in the dance room became his ally. With every step, with every movement, she felt more alive. "You are a great dancer," said one of his classmates, an older woman, who had become his friend. "You must continue." "Thanks," Livia replied, beaming. "I never thought I could feel this way." The physical transformation began to be accompanied by an emotional change. She began to value herself in a way she never had before. Conversations with new friends and group meetings helped her realize that her life didn't need to revolve around Carlos and his approval. One night, while talking to a friend, Livia found herself sharing her most intimate thoughts. "You won't believe it, but I'm thinking about how to get revenge on him," she said, with a mischievous gleam in her eyes. Her friend looked at her, worried. "Revenge? Livia, that doesn't seem like a good idea." "I know, but it's not like you think," she explained, excitedly. "I want to transform myself, show him that I am much more than he always thought." Her friend looked at her with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "You're changing, and that's incredible. But be careful with these plans. Sometimes the best revenge is to live well, don't you think?" Livia smiled, knowing that there was truth in her friend's words. But at the same time, the desire to prove to Carlos that she was capable of more drove her. It wasn't just a matter of revenge, but an affirmation of his new identity. "You are right," she said, a gleam of determination in her eyes. But I want him to see. I want him to know that I am no longer the woman he despised. And so, with each dance class, with each conversation she had, Livia got closer to her goal. She was not only transforming physically, but also emotionally. And when he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the woman Carlos ridiculed. She saw a woman who was strong, determined, and finally, capable of loving herself. The high society party was in full swing, buzzing with laughter and lively conversation. The ballroom was elegantly decorated, sparkling lights reflecting off the crystal glasses and luxurious attire of the guests. Livia, however, did not feel intimidated. After months of dedication and transformation, she stood there, radiant and confident, wearing a stunning red dress that hugged her new curves, a reflection of her self-worth and empowerment. She had meticulously prepared for this moment. Her hair, loose and shiny, fell in soft waves over her shoulders. The makeup was light, but it highlighted the features that Carlos had previously refused to see. Livia wasn't just sporting a new appearance, she was making a statement. As she moved around the room, eyes began to turn to her. Whispers of admiration ran through the crowd. "Did you see who arrived?" "It's Livia," said a woman, amazed. "She looks wonderful." The buzz quickly spread, and Livia couldn't help but feel a wave of satisfaction running down her spine. Carlos, who was standing next to Fernanda, froze when he saw Livia. He tried to hide his embarrassment, but he couldn't help the look of disbelief that formed on his face. The young woman next to him, in her tight dress and excessive makeup, looked at Carlos curiously. "Who is she?" he asked, frowning. "Ah, it's just my ex-wife," Carlos replied, trying to maintain a dismissive tone, but his voice betrayed his discomfort. "She looks different," Fernanda commented, eyes wide. "Different from how you said she was." Carlos, irritated, rolled his eyes. "She's just lost a little weight. That doesn't mean anything." But even as he spoke, he couldn't help but feel the growing pressure of the guests' gazes that turned to Livia, admiring her presence. "If you don't mind, I'll say hello," Fernanda said, already walking away, intrigued by Livia's transformation. Carlos grimaced but remained silent, knowing that any protest would only draw more attention. Livia, who was talking to a group of friends, noticed Fernanda approaching. With a gentle smile, she turned to welcome her. "Hi, Fernanda. You look beautiful today." The sincerity of her words was palpable, and the young woman seemed surprised by Livia's warm attitude. "Thank you, Livia. Well, you look amazing too. What did you do to look like this?" Fernanda shook her head in admiration. "Training and a new perspective on life," Livia replied, looking into Fernanda's eyes with confidence. "Stop letting myself be led by other people's opinions was the first step." She paused, also observing Carlos from a distance. "And you? How are you adapting to your new life?" The question was loaded with meaning, and Livia could barely contain the smile that formed on her lips. Fernanda hesitated, looking at Carlos, who was visibly uncomfortable. "I think we're doing well," she said, but the uncertainty in her voice was clear to Livia. "Good. I hope you're careful with the elephants that appear in your stories," Livia teased, a mischievous gleam in her eyes. The sentence echoed a bitter memory, but now she used it as a weapon, not a wound. Carlos, who was listening to the conversation, couldn't contain himself. "What a bad joke, Livia. You really don't learn, do you?" He tried to maintain his composure, but the tone of his voice betrayed the anger boiling within him. "I learned a lot, Carlos," Livia replied, her smile widening. "I learned that I am more than you ever believed. And I learned that I don't need your validation to be happy." The tension in the air was palpable. The surrounding guests turned to watch the exchange of words, some even holding their breath. Carlos, however, didn't seem to notice the attention they were receiving. His fury was in the foreground. "Do you really think you can come here and show off this new version of yourself like it's a victory? It's ridiculous." "Ridiculous is what you did to me for so many years," Livia replied, her voice firm. "I'm not the same woman you belittled. Look at me now." She paused, allowing his words to sink in. "You underestimated me, Carlos. And this party is proof that I'm capable of much more than you imagined." The murmurs among the guests increased, and some began to applaud, as if the scene were unfolding on a stage. Carlos, now completely at a disadvantage, looked around, realizing that the tide was not in his favor. The look of disdain on his face began to dissolve into confusion and anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Livia," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "You may have changed outwardly, but your past still defines you." "No, Carlos," Livia replied, running her hand through her hair in a gesture that exuded confidence. "My past taught me that I am strong. And today, here, I am the woman I always should have been." The glow in his eyes was undeniable, and she felt a pulsing power within her. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Carlos said, voice shaking with tension. "You may have changed, but I still know your weaknesses." "Maybe you should worry more about yours, Carlos," she teased, taking a step forward, daring him to come closer. "Life isn't about you and your games anymore. It's about me now." Livia was in her moment of glory, and the satisfaction was indescribable. She had freed herself from the chains that bound her, and now, there, in front of everyone, she stood up as a renewed woman, ready to claim her space in the world. As the applause grew louder and the admiring gazes enveloped her, she knew that this was her victory, and no one could take it away from her. Carlos, realizing that his plan to disdain and humiliate had not worked, retreated in the face of Livia's new strength. He stood before a woman who was no longer his property, but someone who had found her voice. And behind all the facade of confidence, a seed of doubt began to grow within him. The party continued to revolve around them, but, for Carlos, the world seemed to have stopped. He no longer had control. Everything had changed, and he didn't know how to deal with it. Livia, in turn, was just beginning to taste the freedom she had finally achieved. The sun was setting on the horizon, turning the sky a vibrant orange, when Carlos decided it was time to confront Livia. He couldn't bear the thought of seeing her so transformed, so far from his clutches. Anger and frustration bubbled inside him, and the image of Livia's new life, full of confidence and joy, was like a knife that cut him with every thought. Upon arriving at her house, Carlos knocked loudly on the door, his impatience almost boiling over. He was not prepared for the scene that would unfold next. When Livia opened the door, the expression on her face was one of surprise, but not fear. She looked more beautiful than ever, with a serene smile and her hair down, as if the weight of the years of abuse had finally lifted. "What do you want, Carlos?" Livia asked, her voice firm, even though her heart was racing. "I want to talk, Livia," he said, trying to maintain his composure, but the anger still dripped into his words. "It doesn't make sense for you to walk away from me like that. We have a story." "History?" Livia laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was a bitter laugh, full of irony. "Are you referring to the history of your humiliations and offenses? To your need to belittle me to feel superior?" Carlos hesitated, the memory of his cruel words coming back to him. He clearly remembered the times he had called her fat and lazy, now feeling increasingly small in front of this woman he once dominated. "Livia, that was in the past. I changed." He tried to argue, his voice rising in desperation. "You can't just leave me like this, as if nothing we've experienced matters. The difference is that I'm no longer the woman you used to look down on. I love myself now, and I won't accept your empty excuses," she replied, her eyes shining with a determination that Carlos had never seen before. A heavy silence hung between them. Carlos felt lost. The woman he knew, who he could manipulate at will, was no longer there. In his place was someone who refused to be a victim. "You cannot do it with me," he said, frustration showing in his voice. I'm your husband. You can't just write me off. Husband? Livia repeated, indignation taking over her. You never cared what that meant. For you, I was just a prop, an ornament, an extension of your image. You don't care about me, Carlos. You only care about what others think of you. Carlos approached, his anger rising. He wasn't ready for this conversation, but the need to regain control was stronger. He knew he had to be persuasive, that he had to use his manipulation skills. Think carefully, Livia. You don't want to throw all that away. Think about everything we've been through together, the promises we made to each other. That was when Livia interrupted him, an expression of disdain on her face. Promises? Your promises were broken with every insult you threw at me. I am no longer the woman you can mold to your will, she said firmly. I found someone who respects me and appreciates me for who I am. Carlos frowned, confused and irritated. What did she mean by that? The idea that Livia had had a relationship with someone else hurt him deeply. He shouldn't be feeling this way. She was his property, and now he felt like he was losing a part of himself. Who is he? Carlos asked, trying to hide his anger. One of those guys you met at the dance? His name is Raphael. Livia's response came like a punch in the stomach. He is kind, affectionate, and treats me with respect. Things you never knew how to do. Carlos took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He had underestimated Livia, and now she was rising up, becoming someone he didn't recognize. You don't know what you're doing. He may be kind now, but men like that can't be trusted. You're going to get hurt again, he said, trying to convince her that he was acting for her own good.
No, Carlos.
You're the one who doesn't know what you're doing. You are still trapped in your own lies and insecurities. I am no longer a victim for you to exploit, Livia replied, her voice firm as a rock. A growing tension hung in the air, and Carlos realized he was no longer in front of the woman he used to control. He stood before a woman who had found her voice, who had decided to fight for herself. Anger consumed him again, but this time it was different. It was a mixture of fear and despair, because he knew he was losing the battle. Livia, he began, but she cut him off. You need to go, Carlos. I don't want you in my life anymore. I'm finally learning to love and respect myself, and I can't let you drag me back to rock bottom, said Livia, determined. Carlos took a step back, his mind spinning. He was beginning to realize that he no longer had control over the situation. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, and he didn't know how to free himself from that reality. You can't just get rid of me like that, he said, his voice now softer, almost pleading. I can change. I can be the man you always wanted.
No, Carlos.
You can't change. What you are is ingrained in you, and I am no longer responsible for your insecurities. I don't want to live under your shadow anymore, Livia stated, her eyes fixed on his, defiant. Carlos observed her, and for the first time, he saw not only the woman he had despised, but a strong, determined, and, above all, free woman. He didn't fully understand how this had happened, but the truth was that she didn't need him anymore. And it devastated him. You're going to regret this, Livia, he said, but his voice was weak. No, I won't. I finally found freedom. And you can't take her away from me, she replied, closing the door in his face. Carlos stood there, in front of that closed door, feeling the weight of rejection and impotence. He didn't know what to do next. In his heart, there was a mixture of anger, despair, and deep sadness. He had lost Livia, but more than that, he had lost himself in his own arrogance. Meanwhile, inside the house, Livia leaned against the door, taking a deep breath, feeling a wave of relief pass through her body. Finally, she was free. Livia was sitting on the sofa, her hands shaking slightly as she held the television remote control. The sound of the screen turning on was just background noise. His mind was occupied with the events that had unfolded over the past few weeks. The transformations she had undergone were not only physical, but also emotional. Looking out the window, he saw the sky darkening, the first stars beginning to emerge. It was a moment of reflection, but also of expectation. She knew that the time for the confrontation with Carlos was approaching. Carlos, in turn, was in the opposite direction, mired in his own insecurities. He looked at himself in the mirror, adjusting his tie and making faces. What he didn't realize was that his image was more damaged than ever. The pride and arrogance that had always defined him was crumbling in the face of the inevitability of what was about to happen. He had underestimated Livia and now found himself cornered. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Fernanda, the lover he tried to convince that everything was under control. "Hey, love. Have you spoken to her yet?" Fernanda's voice sounded anxious on the other end of the line. "Not yet, but I'm going there now. That diary she started writing. I know there's something there that can complicate me. We need to do something before she takes action." Fernanda sighed, showing concern. "Carlos, you need to understand that she is no longer the same woman you left. You underestimated her, and it may come back to haunt you." Carlos hung up the phone, his mind spinning around the possibility of losing everything he had built his new life around. He remembered every insult he had uttered against Livia, every laugh that echoed in his memories like a sharp blade. The anger began to bubble again. He needed control. Upon arriving at the apartment, Carlos found Livia waiting for him. Her expression was a mix of serenity and determination. She had prepared herself for the date, wearing a blouse that highlighted her new curves, a touch of makeup that highlighted her eyes. The transformation was not just external. There was a light in her eyes that Carlos had never seen before. "Carlos," she said, her voice firm, "we need to talk." Carlos forced a smile, but deep down, he felt butterflies in his stomach. "Of course, my dear. What do you want to discuss? About our life, or about how you have been feeling?" Livia laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of joy.
No, Carlos.
"I am no longer willing to submit to your game. Today, I'm going to talk about you." He frowned, confidence beginning to waver. "About me? What do you have to say?" "I have something that could ruin your career, Carlos. Do you remember the recordings I made over the years? The ones you thought you deleted?" Livia's expression was unshakable, her gaze penetrating. Carlos turned pale. "You wouldn't do that, Livia. This is crazy. The insults you have hurled at me over the years are crazy. It's crazy to think that I didn't have a plan. Do you think I'm just the weak, fat woman you always called me? I am much more than that." He approached, anger in his voice. "You cannot do it with me. I have a life, a career. Please, do not do that." "Why wouldn't I? You destroyed me, Carlos. Now you will feel the weight of your actions." Livia's voice was as firm as steel. Carlos began to beg, his tone changing drastically and quickly. "Livia, please. Let's talk. It doesn't have to be like this. We can resolve this another way. I can change. You can change." Livia interrupted, laughing bitterly. "How many times have you said that? And how many times have I believed? You no longer have control over me, and that terrifies you, doesn't it?" He took a deep breath, frustration growing. "What do you want then? What do you intend to do with these recordings?" Livia took a step forward, keeping her gaze fixed. "I want freedom, Carlos. Emotional and financial freedom. I will use these recordings as a guarantee that you will not be able to harm me again. But I will not disclose them. I'm not like you." Carlos looked at her, the expression of despair now evident on his face. "You can't just leave me like this. I can't lose everything." "This is what you deserve," she said with impressive calm. Do you think you can play with people's feelings and not face the consequences? No, Carlos. I'll make a deal. You will give me the freedom I need, and I will not use these recordings. Otherwise, well, you know what will happen. He walked away, mind spinning for a way out. What if I don't accept it? What will you do? You don't have the courage to go through with it. She smiled, a smile that wasn't one of friendship, but one of power. Try me, Carlos. You may think you have control, but I am in charge of my own story now. And I'll make sure you can't hurt me again. The tension in the air was palpable. Livia's transformation had made her a woman who did not allow herself to be intimidated. Carlos, who had always been the aggressor, now found himself in a vulnerable position. He had underestimated how much she had grown, not just in appearance, but in strength and determination. "You are a traitor," he snapped, anger almost consuming him. "I'm a woman who finally loves herself, Carlos. And you, on the other hand, are just a man who can't deal with his own mediocrity." He turned around, trying to regain some of the control he had lost. "You're not going to do well with this. People will know who you really are. And who am I really, Carlos? The woman you tried to destroy? Now I am the woman who is no longer afraid to fight for herself. And you will learn to respect that." Carlos took a deep breath, realizing that his words no longer had the same weight. The game had changed, and he was no longer in control. The look of despair on his face was a portrait of what he really was, a man who had lost himself in his own lies. Livia was finally free. She had taken control of her life, and the outcome was now in her hands. Carlos helplessly stood by, watching her as she walked away, realizing that the woman he had once looked down on had become a force to be reckoned with. And for the first time, he didn't know what to do. Did you enjoy today's story? Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and hit the bell to not miss our upcoming stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.